Most people who fail at publishing don't fail because publishing doesn't work. They don't fail because Amazon is oversaturated or because the algorithm is against them. And they don't fail because they're not capable or they didn't try hard enough. They fail because what happens to them is actually very predictable. Publishing doesn't fail randomly. It fails in patterns. And once you have watched enough people come into this space, start publishing, get excited, and then just disappear, you begin to see the same behaviors show up again and again. The same expectations, the same reactions, the same decisions at the same points in the journey. The biggest underlying reason that I see is most people are psychologically incompatible with boring, delayed, compounding businesses. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It just means that they expected publishing to behave in a way that it never has and it never will. Self-publishing is slow at the beginning. It gives you very little feedback and it asks you to keep going without any real assurance that you're on the right track. And for a lot of people, that creates doubt, frustration, and eventually the feeling that this just isn't working. So instead of jumping straight into tactics or strategies, I want to step back and explain what actually is happening underneath the surface, because once you understand that, a lot of the confusion and the self-doubt starts to make sense. Now, if you are new here, I'm Caroline and I'm a self-publisher who has been creating and selling books on Amazon KDP for over 7 years, and on this channel I show you how to do the same. When I talk about the 1% in this video, I just want to be clear what I mean, because that phrase does get thrown around a lot online. So I'm not talking about viral success. I'm not talking about someone who just had one book that just took off. The 1% are the self-publishers who you never hear about, but they build predictable, reliable income over time. They don't rely on trends and they don't panic when one book is underperforming, and they don't need constant validation to keep going. Their businesses often look boring from the outside because they're built on repetition, structure, and consistency rather than excitement and fun. And I think this is the part that most people don't realize. Most people think they want to be in the 1%, but if they actually lived the day-to-day of how the 1% operates, they will probably find it repetitive, slow, and emotionally uncomfortable. Now, this video isn't about convincing you that you should aim for the 1%. It's just about helping you understand what it takes to get there so that you can decide whether that path makes sense to you or not. With that context in mind, let's talk about the real reasons that most self-publishers fail. One of the biggest reasons that most people fail in self-publishing has nothing to do with skill, intelligence, or effort. It comes down to the mental model that they're using to understand what type of business model self-publishing actually is. Most people don't realize this, but when they start self-publishing, they're subconsciously treating it like a one-shot opportunity. They're thinking in terms of this one book, this one idea, this listing. They're watching one book very closely, waiting for signs that it's working. And when nothing happens, they don't think, okay, this is one data point. They just think this doesn't work. Publishing is not a one product business. It's a series business. It behaves much more like investing than selling a single product. You don't put all your expectations into one stock and expect your entire future to be decided by that one decision. You build a portfolio. Some things perform faster, some take time, some only start making sense once you've added more around them. What usually happens is this. Someone publishes their first book, maybe their second, and then they monitor their results very, very closely. Sales are slow, which is completely normal, but instead of assuming that that is part of the process, they assume that they chose wrong. And so they pivot, they change niches, or they try something completely different. Now they're starting over again. They repeat this cycle again and again, never staying in one place long enough for momentum to build. From the outside, it looks like they have tried lots of things, but in reality, all they've done is just reset their progress multiple times. The publishers who do succeed approach this very differently. They assume from the beginning that no single book matters too much. They expect those early results to be slow. They choose a direction and they commit to building to it long enough for compounding to take effect. That shift alone keeps people in the game long enough for publishing to actually work. Another major reason that people fail is because they confuse being busy with actually moving the business forward. This is especially common with motivated beginners. They're researching niches, they're designing covers, they're tweaking interiors, they're watching videos, they're taking notes, reorganizing files, planning future projects, All that feels productive, and technically it is effort, but not all effort produces progress. A lot of this activity sits in what I would call low risk productivity. It feels safe, it keeps you busy, but it does avoid the most uncomfortable part of publishing, which is actually publishing something and letting the market respond to it. Publishing only gives you real information once you have something live out there and available for sale. You don't learn what works from planning alone. You learn it from publishing, observing, adjusting, and publishing again. But that process requires tolerance for uncertainty, and many people unknowingly avoid that by staying in preparation mode. If you find yourself constantly getting ready but rarely actually publishing, it's worth pausing and asking yourself whether you're building momentum or just staying comfortable. Progress in publishing is measured by output and learning, not by how busy you feel. Now, this is one of the most emotionally challenging parts of self-publishing, and that is the fact that the early stages of publishing a book are pretty quiet and pretty uneventful. You upload a book, you wait. And most of the time, not much happens. And most people interpret that silence as failure. They assume they've done something wrong, chosen the wrong niche, or that this business just doesn't work. But the important thing to understand is that silence is not a sign that publishing isn't working. Publishing doesn't reward you with immediate assurance that you're doing the right thing. It doesn't tell you that you're on the right path. And if you're somebody who does need external feedback to keep motivated, this business is going to feel incredibly uncomfortable for you. The people who do succeed don't react emotionally to it. They keep building, knowing that visibility and traction come later, not first. Another reason that people struggle is that they make big decisions based on very small amounts of information. If a book doesn't sell in its first week, they assume the niche is dead. They receive one negative review and suddenly they doubt everything that they're doing. They see a temporary dip in a bestseller rank and they panic. Publishing data moves slowly. When decisions are driven by emotion instead of evidence, people end up abandoning projects prematurely. They don't give their books enough time to be discovered, to be optimized, or supported by any additional books. The publishers who do succeed learn to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. They look at trends over time, not just little snapshots. They allow enough data to accumulate before deciding if there is anything to change and what to change. Now, this is a big one, especially for people who enjoy the creative side of publishing. But just because something is creative or fun or beautifully designed doesn't mean that it provides value to the market. Publishing rewards usefulness, particularly with low content books, because it rewards books that solve problems, meet a customer's needs, or deliver clear outcomes to the customer. Many people want their creativity to be enough, but customers aren't paying for creative expression alone. They're paying for solutions. The publishers who do succeed are willing to create books that might feel boring or unglamorous or repetitive because they understand that those books meet consistent real-world demand. Creativity still has a place for sure, but it works best when it's served with a clear purpose rather than leading your decision-making. One of the most important distinctions between publishers who succeed and publishers who disappear into the background is whether they ever truly decide that they're running an actual business. Most people don't consciously decide to be hobbyist publishers. It just happens. They publish when they feel like it. They work on projects when they have time. They change direction, change to something else whenever something feels frustrating or boring. There are no clear rules guiding their behavior, no minimum output that they've committed to, no timeline that they're holding themselves accountable to, no criteria for deciding whether something is worth continuing or whether it should be dropped. From the inside, it feels flexible and low pressure, but from the outside, it's inconsistent. And the problem is that publishing rewards consistency and structure, not enthusiasm. When you don't operate with sets of rules, every decision becomes emotional. Every slow week triggers doubt. Every underperforming book feels like a sign that you should change direction. Over time, that constant decision-making becomes exhausting, and most people mistake that exhaustion for failure. The publishers who do succeed remove as much emotion as possible from their process. They decide in advance how often they will publish, how many books they will create in a niche before evaluating it, and what metrics actually matter to them. They don't ask themselves every week whether they feel like continuing. They've already decided. That shift alone creates a lot of stability, and stability is what allows self-publishing to compound. Now, this one is quite a subtle one, and a lot of people don't often realize that they're doing it, and that is that a lot of publishers are waiting for something external to validate their efforts. They're waiting for Amazon to notice them, to notice their books, for the algorithm to reward them, for some kind of breakout moment that proves to them that they're on the right track. They may not say this out loud, but it shows up in things like how closely they watch their results. If sales don't come quickly, they assume that something is wrong. If a book doesn't take off immediately, they interpret that as failure. The problem with this mindset is that it places control outside of you. Instead of focusing on what you can influence, which is things like your output, consistency, and improvement over time, you're waiting on permission to continue. And the publishers who do succeed do not operate this way. They are assuming that no one is coming to choose them or their book. They don't expect recognition very early on in the publishing process, and they don't interpret slow results as a signal to stop. Instead, they build volume and consistency into their strategies so that success becomes increasingly likely over time, not dependent on a single decision from an algorithm. Now, this is one of the most emotionally damaging patterns in self-publishing. When a book underperforms, many people don't see it as a neutral outcome. They see it as a reflection of themselves. They feel embarrassed, they question their abilities, and they really hesitate to publish again. And this emotional attachment creates friction. Instead of thinking, as we said earlier on, oh, this is one data point, they just think maybe I'm not that good at this. And once that doubt starts to creep in, every future decision feels heavier and feels more frustrating. The reality is that individual books don't matter nearly as much as people think they do. In a series-based business, some books perform really well, some don't, and some only start to make sense later on once the rest of the series is built around them. The publishers who do succeed learn to separate their identity from individual outcomes related to their books. They see their books as inventory. Simple as that. Now, publishing is deeply non-linear, and this is where most people misunderstand what's actually happening. For a long time, progress will feel flat. Sales are inconsistent, and your effort doesn't seem to add up and translate into results. And this is the point where most people will quit. They look at their series of books, they see limited traction, and conclude that self-publishing doesn't work for them. But what is often happening is that they're still in that accumulation phase. Compounding only becomes visible once enough of the pieces are in place. More books, more internal traffic, more data, and more trust signals. The publishers who succeed are not immune to doubt during this phase. They simply understand that flat periods are part of the process, not a sign to stop. And most people don't fail because they did something wrong. They fail because they just gave up too early. And this is the deepest and least talked about reason that people fail. Publishing success doesn't just require different actions. It requires different behavior over time. It requires patience when nothing is happening. It needs emotional neutrality when results fluctuate, the ability to keep working without constant feedback. Most people want better results without changing their behavior patterns. The publishers who do succeed don't just do things differently, they become more patient, more measured, and less reactive over time. That internal shift is often the difference between the 99% and the 1%. So, how do the 1% think differently? One of the biggest mistakes that people make when they look at successful publishers is assuming that these people have access to better tools, better information, or just access to some sort of hidden advantage, and in most cases they don't. What separates the 1% from everybody else is not intelligence, creativity, or effort, it's how they think about publishing as a system and how they behave inside that system over long periods of time. Once you understand these differences, a lot of what felt confusing or discouraging starts to make sense. One of the clearest mental shifts you see in successful self-publishers is how they view the books they create. Most people, especially in the beginning, treat each book as a personal project, a passion project, something they've poured all their effort and love into, something they hope will be well received, something that feels like, on some level, a reflection of their ability. The 1% does not think this way. They treat publishing like an infrastructure. A book to them is not an expression of a person's identity. It's a functional asset that serves a specific purpose inside a larger system. It's meant to sit alongside other books, support other books, and collectively do a job. When you stop seeing your books as art projects or passion projects and start seeing them as just a part of an infrastructure, you'll become far less emotionally reactive. A book that does underperform is no longer a disappointment. It's just a weak support beam that you either reinforce later or you work around. This mindset also does help you to publish more consistently because you're no longer asking each book to justify your effort or validate your decision to keep going. It just needs to exist and do its job. The 1%, they're not chasing excitement. They're not trying to feel inspired every time they sit down to work. and they're not particularly interested in anything remotely fun or exciting when it comes to their books. They deliberately choose boring because boring niches tend to have predictable demand. Boring problems tend to repeat year after year, and this doesn't mean that their work is careless or it's low quality. It just means that the topic or the niche itself is stable. Most people struggle with this because they want publishing to feel interesting. They want variety. They want to follow their curiosity. And while there's nothing wrong with that, that often conflicts with building something that builds up over time. Exciting niches tend to burn hot and then fade. Trend-driven ideas attract a lot of competition quickly, but then lose momentum. Boring niches, on the other hand, usually look the same year after year, which is exactly why they continue to sell. I've been publishing videos for many years now, and if you go back over the years, you'll still see that the same niches I was talking about 3-4 years ago that were successful but boring are still successful but still boring. Another key difference is how the 1% structure what they want to publish. Most beginners think in terms of one-off books, one idea at a time, one product at a time. Each book is expected to perform just on its own. The 1% thinks in terms of a series. They build a series because series reduces friction. They create internal traffic. They make it easier for one book to support the next. They reward consistency. Series also change the way that customers interact with your catalog of books. Instead of just discovering you once and leaving, they're given a path to stay longer, to explore more, and trust your brand. From a business perspective, this is far more efficient than constantly starting from scratch with every new book. Now, this is often misunderstood. Optimizing for speed does not mean rushing or producing low-quality books. It means removing any unnecessary friction from the process. The 1% uses templates. They reuse structures, interior structures. They make decisions quickly. They avoid overthinking. Their goal is to not make each book absolutely perfect. The goal is to make each book good enough to serve its purpose. Speed creates repetition. Repetition creates learning. Learning compounds far faster than perfection. Most people overestimate how much perfection matters and underestimate how much learning matters. Finally, the 1% doesn't just tolerate delayed gratification, they expect it. They plan for it. They assume that results will lag behind effort, that the early months will be quiet, that progress will be invisible for a little while. Because they do expect this, they are not emotionally destabilized when it actually happens. Most people do say that they understand that self-publishing takes time, but emotionally, they still expect reassurance and results early. And when that reassurance doesn't come, they start to doubt everything. The 1% does not need validation. They trust the process because they understand how compounding works. They don't rush to judge themselves or their strategy based on short-term outcomes. They just give the system time to do its job. Now, by this point, a lot of people start asking a very reasonable question. They say, okay, I can see myself in some of these failure patterns. I understand that the 1% thinks differently, but what do I actually do with that information? And this is where a lot of advice online just starts to fall apart because it just jumps straight into tactics without addressing behavior. So instead of giving you a long list of things to try, I want to walk you through a small number of shifts that actually move people from the 99% to the 1% over time. None of these are complicated, but they do require commitment, some patience, a willingness to be uncomfortable for longer than most people would expect. So step one of the biggest reasons people struggle to make progress in publishing is that they never stay in one place long enough for anything to compound. They frequently move between niches. They restart with new ideas. Each individual decision might make sense in the moment, but collectively, they prevent momentum from building. Moving into the 1% starts with choosing one lane and committing to it longer than feels comfortable. That means one target customer, one problem, and one general format or template or interior structure. Not forever, but long enough for patterns to emerge and for data to become meaningful. This doesn't mean that you never adjust or you never pivot. It just means that you stop reacting to short-term discomfort. You give yourself enough time to actually learn what works before deciding whether to change it. Most people quit because they confuse this feels slow with this is wrong. The 1% understands that slow is usually a prerequisite for sustainable. Step 2, the biggest enemy of consistency is decision fatigue. When you haven't decided in advance how you're going to behave, every slow week becomes a debate. Every underperforming book triggers another round of questioning what you're doing. And over time, that constant decision-making becomes exhausting. The 1% avoids this by setting non-negotiable rules. For example, how many books will I publish before evaluating a niche? How often will I publish regardless of results? What metrics actually matter and which ones am I going to ignore? These rules don't have to be extreme. They just need to exist. And once behavior is pre-decided, emotion has far less influence over what you're doing. You're no longer asking yourself whether you feel like continuing. You are, because you decided that at the beginning. You're just going to be following through on a commitment that you've already made. Step 3. Most people approach self-publishing as if each book needs to justify itself immediately. They want to know, is this book selling? Is this niche working? Should I keep going? The problem with this approach is that it focuses entirely on short-term outcomes. The 1% builds for compounding. They think about how the books support each other, how series create that internal traffic, how trust builds over time with customers and with Amazon KDP. And this means that they're not discouraged when individual books don't perform so great. They understand that the value of a book usually increases once it becomes a part of a larger series. Step 4, another major shift that separates the 1% from everybody else is how they measure success. Most people focus on daily sales, bestseller rank fluctuations, or short-term spikes. These numbers are emotionally loud, but strategically weak. The 1% looks at the bigger picture. They look at monthly trends, sales growth, repeat customers, and overall stability over time. This broader view makes it so much easier to stay calm through those inevitable ups and downs. Redefining success doesn't mean ignoring data. It means choosing data that actually reflects progress. Step 5, this is where a lot of people struggle, not because it's hard, but because it's not glamorous. It's not exciting. The 1% is not exciting. They're not chasing the next big thing. They show up, they publish, they repeat. And consistency in publishing is not about motivation. It's about removing the friction and making it easier to keep going than to stop. And this usually looks boring from the outside, but boring is what allows systems to form, habits to solidify, and results to compound. Most people underestimate how powerful boring consistency really is. Step 6, and this is an important one, quality matters. It always has and it always will. But quality without volume rarely works in self-publishing. 1 book will not change your life. 5 books probably won't either. 10 books might start to create momentum, but even then, results can still stay pretty unpredictable. Volume does several things at once. It improves your skills, it gives you more data, it builds trust with the platform, so with Amazon KDP, and it creates this internal traffic throughout your series of books. Most importantly, volume reduces that emotional weight of individual outcomes. When you have many books, no single result feels like the only one. The 1% doesn't publish endlessly without thought, but they do understand that volume is a mechanism that allows quality to be actually discovered. Now, by the time somebody gets to this point, they usually feel one of 2 things. Either they feel relief because what they've been experiencing finally makes sense, or they feel a little bit uncomfortable because they can see very clearly now where they've been getting in their own way. Both reactions are normal. This isn't about pushing anyone to try harder or do more. It's about helping you make an informed decision about whether this business model actually suits you, and if it does, what kind of mindset it takes to stay in it long enough to actually benefit from it. So the real question isn't whether publishing works. It clearly does. The question is whether this kind of work works for you. And this comes down to a few very simple but confronting trade-offs. Do you want excitement or do you want freedom? Excitement feels good in the moment. It comes from fun, it comes from fast feedback, it comes from visible progress. Freedom, on the other hand, usually comes from doing the same unglamorous, unexciting things over and over again long after the excitement has worn off. Do you want to feel successful or do you want to be successful? Feeling successful often comes from short-term wins and external validation. Being successful in publishing usually looks much more invisible. It looks like a steady income. It looks like predictable systems and actually very little outside recognition. So this doesn't mean that you have to be perfect or hyper disciplined. It means you need to be honest about what you're willing to tolerate emotionally while you're waiting for the results to catch up. Now, if there's one part of the video that I would encourage you to pause on, it's these 3 questions. The first question is this: can you work for months without feedback? Can you keep publishing when no one is reviewing or acknowledging what you're doing? Can you trust the process even when there's no immediate evidence that it's paying off? Because for most people, that phase lasts longer than they expect. The second question is, can you publish without emotional attachment to individual outcomes? Can you treat a book that underperforms as information rather than a personal failure? Can you move on to the next project without carrying disappointment with you? Publishing becomes much easier once individual books stop feeling like the sum of your whole business? And the third question is, can you repeat the same core tasks without needing excitement to stay engaged? Can you create similar books in similar niches for the same customer, even when it feels repetitive or boring? Because that repetition is what allows systems to form and results to compound. If you answered no to one or more of these questions, that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means that this business model may not align with how you are right now, and that is totally okay. So if you've got to this point, thank you for staying to the end and watch this entire video. And if you've thought, this actually explains a lot, that is a good sign. It doesn't mean you need to rush off and do more. It just now means that you understand the game you're playing and you can choose intentionally whether you want to keep playing it. If you did enjoy this video, YouTube thinks that you might like these ones too. So please go check them out to learn more about self-publishing your own books on Amazon KDP. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.